My name is Caleb, and that happened about 3 years ago when I was 30. At the time, I was working as a civil engineer at a construction company in Chicago, but my heart was always set on the small village where I grew up, called Willow Creek in the state of Minnesota. It was a quiet place, surrounded by dense forests and wheat fields that seemed to be lost on the horizon. My family had moved to the big city when I was a teenager, after a wave of violence swept through the village. I never went back there until that day. I was on a work trip to inspect a bridge in a town near Willow Creek. When I finished the work, it was already late afternoon, and a light rain began to fall. I decided, almost on impulse, to take a walk around the village where I spent my childhood. The road leading there was narrow and dimly lit, with tall trees that seemed to bend over the asphalt. The wind blew hard, and the dry leaves danced in, the air creating an almost surreal atmosphere. When I arrived in the village, I was shocked by the state of abandonment. Houses that were once teeming with life were now in ruins, with broken windows and collapsed roofs. The only light I saw came from a small house at the end of the main street. It was the home of Thomas, an old childhood friend who I knew still lived there. Thomas has always been a lonely but kind fellow. I remembered how when we were children, I and other friends used to make fun of him for being poor and different. At the time, I didn't understand the impact our pranks had on him. Decided to stop at Thomas's house. When I knocked on the door, he took a while to answer. When he finally appeared, he looked older than I remembered, with sunken eyes and a face scarred by time. He recognized me immediately, and to my surprise seemed genuinely happy to see me. Invited me in, and I accepted, feeling a mixture of curiosity and guilt. The house was simple, with old furniture and a strong, musty smell. Thomas took a bottle of whiskey and offered me a sip. I accepted, despite knowing I still had to drive back. As we talked, the rain outside began to fall harder, and the wind howled against the windows. Thomas told me about how the village had changed since I left. Most of the families had moved, and the few that remained lived in isolation, almost like ghosts. He mentioned something that intrigued me. "Do you remember Samuel?" he asked. Samuel was another kid in our class, known for being troubled and always getting into trouble. I remembered him, but I didn't know what had happened. Thomas looked at me with a grim expression and said, "He disappeared years ago. And I was the one who found him." Thomas paused for a long time, as if struggling to find the right words. He looked at the bottle of whiskey in his hands, spinning it slowly before continuing, "Samuel wasn't a good person, you know. He always had a way of getting into trouble, but no one deserved what happened to him." Thomas's voice was low, almost a whisper, and I had to lean forward to hear properly. The wind outside howled, banging against the windows of the house, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He started getting involved with a group of strange people who showed up here. They were not criminals, at least not in the way we imagine. Were different. Samuel became obsessed with them, saying that they had answers to everything. One day he simply disappeared. Nobody knew where he went, but I had my suspicions. Thomas took another sip of whiskey, and I noticed that his hands trembled slightly. He seemed to hesitate before continuing, as if afraid to say what came next. Few weeks later, I was in the woods chopping firewood, when my dog Duke started acting strange. He stopped suddenly, staring at the trees, and began growling. I had never seen him like this. As I approached, I saw something hanging from a tall branch. It was Samuel. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to block the image. He was different. It didn't look human. The body was deformed, as if it had been stretched and twisted in a way that was unnatural. And the eyes, his eyes were open but empty, as if he were still alive but no longer there. I felt an intense cold run through my body. I tried to say something, but the words didn't come out. Thomas continued, his voice now barely audible. "After that, things here only got worse. People started hearing things at night, crying, laughing, footsteps. Some have disappeared, others have stayed. Different. I don't know what's going on, but I know it's not natural. And I feel like they're out there waiting." At that moment, a loud noise coming from outside made us jump. It was as if something had knocked on the window. Thomas looked at me with an expression of genuine fear. "They're out there," he whispered. "They always are." I got up and went to the window. but I saw nothing but darkness and heavy rain. Still, I felt a presence, as if something was watching me from the outside. The air felt heavier, and the silence. Inside the house was oppressive. Thomas insisted that I stay until the rain passes. He offered me an old sofa to sleep on, and I accepted, despite knowing that I would not be able to rest. As I settled in, I heard Thomas mumbling something to himself, as if he were praying. The sound of rain and wind was constant, but every now and then I swore I heard something else. Footsteps on the roof, scratches on the door. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the fear was there, growing by the minute. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that night wouldn't end well. The night seemed to have no end. Lying on the couch, I tried to concentrate on the sound of rain hitting the roof, but every noise made me jump. The wind howled like a living creature, and I swore to hear footsteps outside, as if someone or something was circling the house. Thomas had turned off all the lights, saying that it was better not to attract attention, and the darkness inside the house was almost absolute. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Suddenly, a high-pitched sound echoed through the house. It was as if someone had scratched the front door. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thomas?" I whispered, but there was no response. I looked to the side and saw that he was still sitting in the chair, motionless, as if in a trance. The sound came again, stronger this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was out there, and it seemed to be trying to get in. "Don't open the door," Thomas said suddenly, his voice so low that I hardly heard it. "They like to play. If you open it, they'll come in." I didn't know what he meant by they, but I didn't have the courage to ask. The fear was so present that I could hardly think. The sound of scratches continued, but now it came from different parts of the house, from the windows, from the walls, even from the roof. It was as if we were surrounded. My mind started racing, trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening. Maybe it was animals or the wind hitting something loose, but deep down I knew it was nothing like that. The air inside the house was heavy, charged with an energy that I couldn't explain. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound, and approached the window. The curtain was closed, but I could feel that something was on the other side, waiting. "Don't look," Thomas said, this time firmer. "They know when you're looking." I froze in place, my hand shaking near the curtain. The sound of scratching suddenly stopped, and the house fell silent. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, but then I heard something that made me stop breathing. A low, almost imperceptible cry coming from outside. It was a sad, desperate sound, as if someone was suffering. I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to open the door, but Thomas's voice echoed in my mind. "Don't open it." The crying continued, but now it seemed to come from different directions, as if moving around the house. I stepped away from the window and went back to the couch, trying to calm down. Thomas was still sitting in his chair, his eyes fixed on the door. He seemed to be in a constant state of alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it seemed like the night would never end. The crying outside continued for a time that seemed endless. It was a sound that crept into my mind, as if it were trying to convince me to do something. Open the door perhaps, or look out the window. I covered myself with a blanket that Thomas had given me, but it didn't help ward off the cold that came from inside me. My eyes were fixed on the door, and every second seemed like an eternity. Thomas didn't move, as if in a trance-like state, and I didn't know if he was awake or asleep. Suddenly the crying stopped. The silence that followed was so intense that I could hear the sound of my own heart beating. The rain outside had subsided, and the wind was now just a whisper. For a moment, I thought that maybe it was over, that whatever was out there was gone. But then a new sound began, a sound of slow, shuffling footsteps, as if someone were walking in circles around the house. They were heavy, as if the person was carrying something. "They're testing you," Thomas said suddenly, causing me to jump on the couch. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. "They know you're new here. They want to see how far they can go." I didn't know what to answer. My mind was a confusion of fear and incredulity. Who were they, and why were they doing this? Thomas gave no further explanation. He just kept sitting, his eyes still fixed on the door. The footsteps outside stopped. Suddenly, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was wrong. The air inside the house felt heavier, as if it were charged with electricity. I looked at Thomas, expecting him to say something, but he remained motionless. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze, a loud thud on the door, as if something had hit it hard. The door shook, and I almost screamed. The thud came again, and this time I saw the doorknob move slightly. "They're trying to get in," Thomas said, his voice now a barely audible whisper. "No matter what, don't open the door." I curled up on the couch, trying to make myself as small as possible. My eyes were fixed on the doorknob, which was now moving slowly, as if someone was trying to turn it. The thud came again, and this time, the door shook so hard that I thought it was going to fall. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to run, but where? The house was small, and there was nowhere to hide. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noises. The doorknob stopped moving, and the footsteps outside ceased. I looked at Thomas, hoping for some guidance, but he remained motionless, his eyes still fixed on the door. The air inside the house was heavy, and I felt like I was being watched. Then I heard something that made me stop breathing, a low whisper coming from inside the house. It was barely noticeable, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was inside the house with us. The wind outside howled with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was as if he was trying to say something, but the words were lost in the noise of the rain hitting the roof. I curled up on the couch, trying to focus on anything other than the creepy sound outside. Thomas was still sitting in his chair, motionless, his eyes fixed on the door. He seemed to be in a constant state of alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. "The wind always does that," Thomas said suddenly, his voice hoarse and tired. "It sounds like he's trying to tell you something, but it's just his way. The forest is like that. She talks to us, but no one knows what she's saying." I didn't answer. My heart was still beating fast, and I could barely think straight. The sound of the wind seemed to be approaching, as if it were circling the house, and I swore I heard something that sounded like a distant murmur, but it was impossible to distinguish if it was real or just my mind playing with me. The rain began to fall heavily, and the noise on the roof was deafening. I got up and approached the window, pulling slightly the curtain to look outside. The darkness was almost complete, but the faint light of the moon reflected off the puddles of water that formed on the ground. The wheat field around the house swayed violently, as if something was moving among the plants. I felt a chill down my spine and let go of the curtain quickly. "Did you see anything?" Thomas asked, his voice now more alert. I shook my head, but I couldn't say anything. My body was still shaking, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the air was getting heavier. The wind howled again, and this time it seemed to come from inside the house, as if it were circling around us. I looked at Thomas, expecting him to say something, but he just shook his head slowly, as if he had already accepted that there was nothing we could do. Suddenly, a loud noise coming from outside made us jump. It was as if something had knocked on the door hard. The handle shook slightly, and I felt an almost uncontrollable urge to run and lock the door, but Thomas grabbed me by the arm. "No," he said, his voice firm. "They like to play. If you open it, they'll come in." I didn't know what he meant by they, but I didn't have the courage to ask. The fear was so present that I could hardly think. The noise at the door suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was almost worse. The wind outside had died down, and the rain was now just a constant, almost comforting sound. I looked at Thomas, hoping for some guidance, but he just shook his head again. "They leave when they're ready," he said. "We just have to wait." I sat back on the couch, trying to calm down, but I knew that night wouldn't end well. The silence that followed was disturbing. The rain continued to fall, but now it was a constant, almost monotonous sound, as if nature was trying to calm us. "Sit down after the scare." Thomas was still sitting in the chair, his eyes fixed on the door, but he looked more relaxed, as if he knew the worst was over. I, on the other hand, was still tense, every muscle in my body alert, expecting something to happen at any moment. "They're leaving," Thomas said, as if reading my thoughts. "But they always leave something behind, something that reminds you that they were here." I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't have the energy to ask. My body was exhausted, and my mind was a jumble of fear and relief. I looked at the clock on the wall and saw that it was already past 3 a.m. The night seemed to have lasted an eternity. The wind outside began to blow again, but this time it was softer, almost like a whisper. I got up and approached the window, pulling slightly the curtain to look outside. The wheat field was still swaying, but now it seemed calmer, as if the forest had calmed down. The rain had subsided, and the moon was beginning to appear between the clouds, lightly illuminating the land around the house. "You should try to sleep," Thomas said, his voice now gentler. "Tomorrow morning you can leave. The road will be wet, but it's better than staying here." I shook my head, but I couldn't say anything. The idea of sleeping in that house seemed impossible, but I knew he was right. I needed to rest, even if it was for a few hours. I sat down on the couch again and covered myself with the blanket, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Thomas got up and went to the kitchen, returning with a bottle of water. "Drink it," he said, handing it to me. "It helps calm nerves." I thanked him and took a sip, feeling the cold water run down my throat. The silence in the house was almost comforting, and I began to feel a little calmer. The wind outside was now just a distant sound, and the rain had stopped completely. "I'm going to stay awake," Thomas said, sitting back in his chair. "You can sleep. I'll wake you up if something happens." I didn't need to be convinced. My eyes were heavy and my body was crying out for rest. I lay down on the couch and closed my eyes, trying not to think about what had happened that night. The sound of the wind and the rustling of the trees outside were the last sounds I heard before falling asleep. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky and daylight came in through the cracks in the curtains. For a moment, I felt relieved, as if the night had been just a nightmare. But then I remembered everything. The noises, the howling wind, the feeling that something was out there watching us. I sat down quickly on the couch and looked around. Thomas was no longer in the chair, and the house was silent. "Thomas?" I called, my voice still hoarse from sleep. There was no response. I got up and went to the kitchen, but he wasn't there. The bottle of water he had given me was still on the table, next to a piece of stale bread. I looked out the window and saw that the wheat field was calm, bathed in sunlight. It seemed impossible that that same landscape had been so frightening a few hours earlier. I decided to go out to look for Thomas. The front door was unlocked, and I pushed it in slowly, feeling the fresh morning air on my face. The ground was soaked from the previous night's rain, and the puddles of water reflected the sunlight. I looked around but saw no sign of Thomas. The wheat field stretched as far as the eye could see, and the forest in the background seemed calm and silent. "Thomas," I called again, my voice echoing through the field. There has been no response yet. I was starting to get worried. Where could he be? I went back inside the house and looked around, looking for some sign of him. It was then that I saw something, a piece of paper with my name on the table. I quickly took the paper that said, "I left. Don't try to find me. They leave, but they always leave something behind. Take care of yourself." The note was short, but the words sent chills down my spine. What did Thomas mean by they, and why had he left without telling me? I looked out the window again, but the field was still empty. I decided it was time to leave. The house now looked even scarier in daylight, as if it held secrets I didn't want to discover. I grabbed my things and left, locking the door behind me. The truck was still where I had left it, and the engine started on the first try. I looked at the house for the last time before getting into the car. She seemed so ordinary, so harmless, but I knew there was something wrong in that place, something I could never explain. As I drove back to the main road, I saw something that made me stop the car. In the wheat field, where there had been nothing before, there was now a straw man. He was dressed in old tattered clothes, and his face was just a burlap sack with painted eyes. The wind shook his clothes, making him seem almost alive. I couldn't take my eyes off him, but then I realized something that left me paralyzed. The scarecrow was wearing a hat that I recognized. It was Thomas's hat. I stood on the dirt road, staring at the scarecrow. My heart was beating fast, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Thomas's hat was unmistakable, an old straw hat faded by the sun, and the clothes I was recognizing, they reminded me of the ones he wore in our teens. How did this scarecrow get there? And why was he dressed as Thomas? Was he the one who put it on before leaving? Several questions in my head. I tried to let it go and convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but something in the back of my mind told me that it wasn't. I decided not to investigate. The feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore. I put the truck in gear and followed the road, trying to get away from that place as quickly as possible. As I drove, I looked in the rearview mirror several times, almost expecting to see the scarecrow moving or Thomas appearing out of nowhere. But the countryside was behind me, and soon I was on the main road, surrounded by the familiar countryside landscape. Despite being far from Thomas's house, the feeling of unease did not disappear. The words of the note he left echoed in my mind. They leave, but they always leave something behind. What did he mean by that? Who were they? And what had they left behind? I had no answers, but I knew that this experience would change something in me forever. When I arrived in the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station for gas and coffee. The attendant, a middle-aged man with a heavy accent, looked at me curiously as I walked in. "Did you come from the direction of Willow Creek?" he asked as he brewed coffee. I shook my head hesitantly. Yes, I spent the night there. He frowned as if I had said something troubling. "Willow Creek is a weird place," he said, placing the coffee in front of me. "A lot of people say that. Things happen there that no one can explain. Better not to stay there too long." I didn't respond, but his words only added to the sense of discomfort I already felt. I paid for the coffee and returned to the truck, determined to leave that experience behind. As I drove back home, my mind kept turning to Thomas. Where was he? Why had he left without warning? And what had happened in that house during the night? Time passed, and I knew I would never have answers to these questions. I never went back to Willow Creek. Despite all the doubts and questions I still have, I know that this place holds something that I am not prepared to face. Thomas was never seen again, and the scarecrow is still there in the middle of the field, as a silent reminder of what happened that night. Sometimes, when the wind blows strongly, I can still hear him whisper, as if he's trying to tell me something. But I learned to ignore it. I learned that some things are better left behind. Willow Creek is one of those places, a place where past and present intermingle, leaving questions that no one can explain. And me? I move on, carrying the memories of that night with me. But one thing is for sure, I was never the same again. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.